Hi, today we're going to be comparing the Ryzen 5800X 3D and the 5600X when using an RX 7900 XTX and 32GB of 3600MHz CL16 RAM on Windows 10 Home with rebar enabled. I've tested 9 games at 3 resolutions with multiple settings and upscaling where available and ray tracing on and off where available too. The games I chose are some demanding ones from 2023, particularly ones that hammer your CPU a little bit, and also a few modern popular multiplayer titles. And I try to choose areas within those games which cause particularly high demand on the CPU. Before each game, I'll do a little intro part where I describe where I tested and why I used that area, and any other information that I feel is important. And then at the end of each game, I'll give my thoughts on the CPUs in that game too, for anyone who's interested. All my data was taken with MSI Afterburner, even in the games where I used the inbuilt benchmark, but as there's so many settings in this, I won't be showing the MSI Afterburner on the screen. We'll just have the data and then a bit of gameplay behind it. So anyway, let's take a look and try and figure out whether it's worth it going with a 5800X 3D over the 5600X when using the 7900 XTX. In the words of Mario, let's a go. So we're starting out with Immortals of Aveum, and this little bit where I fire the fireballs into the sky, I use that because that was actually the most punishing part of the entire game, at least that I've played anyway. And just by chance I realised that throwing them fireballs into the sky massively drops your FPS, so you'll see my minimums are probably lower than what you can expect, but should give you like a worst case scenario. This was a little run I used, and it's only a short one, but I picked this area because it's very demanding, and the game as it's very CPU intensive, as you'll see. Starting out with 4K max settings, and you'll see there's already a big difference between the CPUs, and with upscaling enabled, the X3D was able to beat the weaker CPU by up to 27% in the averages, although the 1% lows and minimums are within margin of error. Neither CPU ever locked 60 at any setting in this particular test. Just as a note, my max settings is everything turned up to the absolute maximum, and as there's no actual graphics presets, I decided for my low setting I'd just turn everything down to minimum. And at these settings we managed to scrape a lock 60 with both CPUs with FSR performance now. The X3D is slightly better in the averages at this setting and with no upscaling enabled, but with FSR balanced it once again destroys the 5600X by 25% on the averages. So anyway, now we're going to move down to 1440p max settings, and we see the 5600X immediately hitting a wall here, except for some pretty good gains in the minimums, and this allows the 5800X 3D up to 31% better averages, whilst having much smoother percentile lows and much better minimums too, allowing it to comfortably lock 60 while the 5600X can't, although even the X3D does hit its limits at FSR quality. So now we're going to turn down to the lowest settings. We see some good gains with the 5800X 3D here at all settings. The average has been up to a massive 30% faster this time, with 1% lows up to 34% smoother, and able to get a nice locked 90 FPS there. The 5600X is very comfortably at a lock 60 now though, at least.
Make easy money unloading cargo.
So now we're going to go down to 1080p. We're not going to include loads of settings here, because I doubt there's many people using this card for 1080p single player games. But as you'll see, the 5800X 3D is absolutely destroying the 5600X here, and is actually 82% faster with FSR quality. Looking like the 5600X is hitting the same wall it was at 1440p, while the 5800X 3D is left to run free. Yeah, so as you can see in this one, this game's really dependent on your CPU. And even with the 5800X 3D, you're going to have to turn down the settings, or use FSR if you want to lock 60. You are able to lock 60 with a better image quality though, using less FSR than you would with the 5600X, and even at max settings at 1440p and below. But if you don't mind turning down the settings and using FSR, the 5600X is capable of a pretty comfortable lock 60, so could still be enough for you. For those who want to play at max and don't like going below DLSS FSR quality though, you'll at least want the 5800X 3D. Next up we have Fortnite, and I use the DX12 mode, so when I'm using Epic or the high settings, Nanite and Lumen, software Lumen, will be enabled, and then when I go down to medium and low, they're disabled automatically. The actual replay I used was deleted just after I recorded the data, so this is just a bit of gameplay from a different replay. But in the run that I actually did, I tried to pick an area where it was pretty hard on the CPU compared to other areas in that replay. For the upscaling, I used TSR, the epic setting, which I've just shortened to TSRE for the sake of the video. And when no upscaling was enabled, I used TAA for the anti-aliasing. So, starting out at 4K epic settings, and as you'll see, both CPUs are pretty much the same. Sorry, my cat's just rubbing his head off the mic. Anyway, there's not much difference. Both CPUs are able to lock 60 here, but I don't know, I probably wouldn't play at these settings myself. Not with these systems anyway. Now we move down to 4K high settings, and we do start to see some small differences now, with some small gains in the 1% lows for the 5800X3D and a little boost to the averages, but it's nothing major. So now we're going to go down to some more competitive settings with 4K medium and low, and now the 5800X is actually starting to show some gains here, with a 32% boost to the averages at low settings and 14% faster at medium, and it's up to a massive 57% smoother in the 1% lows at low settings, although whether everyone's going to be able to feel this at such high FPS anyway is questionable. So that's it for 4K now, down to 1440p, and we see a similar story as we did at 4K epic here. The X3D being very slightly faster than the 5600X, with 1% lows up to 5% better. Both CPUs able to lock 90 FPS now, so a lot more reasonable than using 4K epic settings. Now we're going to turn down to high settings, and we're looking like both systems are limited by the CPU now, and we're only seeing some tiny gains with the X3D when adding upscaling, and nothing for the 5600X. Allowing the X3D up to 22% better averages, 17% smoother 1% lows, and 29% higher minimums, and allowing for a nice comfortable locked 120. Now we're going down to medium and low settings, and due to the limitations of the CPUs, we're seeing pretty similar numbers to what we were at 4K, other than for the 5800X3D at medium settings where we are getting a nice boost, increasing its gains over the 5600X at this setting to 33% in the averages and 44% in the 1% lows, with much better minimums, once again allowing the X3D to max out a 240Hz monitor at medium settings, whereas the 5600X has to go down to low to do the same. Now we have 1080p epic settings, where the 5800X3D is up to 16% faster, with TSR epic at quality settings. The gaps in the 1% lows aren't massive here though. Now we have 1080p high settings, and we see some pretty massive gains for the 5800X3D here. It's up to 36% faster, with 27% smoother 1% lows and 32% better minimums. Finally for Fortnite, we have medium and low settings at 1080p. And once again, the numbers aren't that dissimilar from what they were at 1440p and 4K here. We still get some huge gains for the 5800X3D, but once again, can you tell the difference at such high frame rates? I don't know if I can, but maybe you would. I might try and do a blind test on myself one day. Anyway, that's it for Fortnite, so as you can see, there is some pretty good gains to be made with the 5800X3D here. Especially if you're someone just looking for outright maximum frame rates, there's quite a big boost if you are a person that can tell the difference, or just someone that owns a 240Hz monitor and would like to max it out. It might be worth it for you. There's also some pretty good gains at 1440p high settings if you're looking for a nice combination of eye candy, you have all the ray tracing on, etc., and the ability to lock 120 FPS at the same time. But other than that, I'd say the 5600X is fine if you just want some competitive frame rates and you're not bothered about nanite and looming, or you are and you're happy with a 90 FPS lock or 100 FPS, then you can still do pretty good with the 5600X. So the higher end CPU in this game is more of a nice to have than a necessity. Now we have the newest game in the video, which is Armored Core 3 Fires of Rubicon. This is my little run on the screen for where I jump off the hill here, and it's pretty CPU demand in this area, especially when I get down to the bottom and start doing this little strafing thing. This is the most demanding part of the run that I did, and it drops your frame rate quite a bit. There could be more CPU demanding areas in the game, but I haven't had a chance to play much, and I thought there's quite a lot going on here with all the different levels and buildings and enemies, loads of reflections and fast movement, so I'm hoping this is going to give you a good idea of what you can expect with these CPUs. There is actually a frame cap in this game at 120 FPS, but as neither CPU is able to lock that, I thought it was still worth including just to see which give you the smoother experience. So we're going to start with 4K, and as you can see, no CPU is able to lock the 120 there. And at max and high settings, both the CPUs perform very similarly, but there is a nice boost at low settings for the 5800X3D, particularly in the 1% lows, which are 16% smoother than the 5600X, and the minimums, which are 27% better with the 5800X3D. Now we're going down to 1440p, and as you can see, turning down the settings, the only real gains that you're going to see are in the minimums here. This is most likely due to the cap, as you would probably get higher averages at least if that wasn't there. But either way, the 5800X3D was able to beat the weaker CPU by 10% in the averages, up to 18% in the 1% lows, and 23% in the minimums. Now we're going to move down to 1080p, and we're just going to include one setting here because it just performs similar to 1440p. And at this setting we see the X3D beating the 5600X by 9% in the averages, 17% in the 1% lows, and 31% in the minimums. So quite a bit smoother. It's a shame about the cap though, it would have been nice if it wasn't there just so we could see how much performance it can actually get over the weaker CPU, but even still you're still getting some benefit with the 5800X3D here. Both CPUs are still able to get a nice high frame rate though, and neither are giving you absolutely terrible 1% lows, but the X3D will offer a slightly smoother experience overall. Now we're going to move on to The Last of Us Part 1, and this is my little run here, and I use this area because it's really harsh on the CPU. It's also pretty GPU demanding, but it crushes your CPU, so as far as I've seen in the game, it's the best place to test your processor. And I won't be including many FSR settings in this one because the game is so limited by your CPU, at least in this area, so adding more FSR doesn't actually give you any more FPS, and it actually increases the amount of stutters that you'll get. So anyway, we're going to start with 4K Ultra settings, and we're going to include FSR balanced here because it did give me a slight boost over quality. And as you'll see in this game, at least in this area, you're already CPU limited, and there's already a good benefit to the 5800X3D here, being 24% faster in the averages, 56% smoother in the 1% lows, and the minimums are 25% higher with FSR balanced enabled. In hindsight, I probably should have included quality instead, as it probably would have shown that the 5800X was able to lock 60 with less upscaling than the 5600X. But anyway, on to high settings, and here we did use FSR quality, as balanced offered no benefit. And here we do see that we don't need any FSR to lock 60 with the 5800X3D, but with the 5600X we do, so you will get better image quality here. And if you do add FSR, you are getting a massive boost to smoothness with the 5800X3D. Also, the 5600X was only just scraping 60 there. So now we have medium settings, and there's not a massive amount of FPS to be gained here, but it does allow both CPUs better 1% lows and minimums, helping the 5600X get that lock 60 pretty easily now. Although both CPUs performing slightly worse in these metrics with FSR here. This setting does bring the CPUs a little closer together, but there is still some really big gains with the X3D. Now we have 1440p Ultra settings, and this is where we really start to just, well, immediately see the differences between the CPUs. And even without FSR we have 28% better averages, 43% better 1% lows, and 25% higher minimums for the X3D, and adding FSR only makes the gaps in the 1% lows and minimums bigger. So now we have high settings, and as you can see we're pretty much within margin of error of the Ultra settings, so there's no real point going down here, and both systems got slightly worse minimums with FSR enabled.
Let's do this.
So now we have medium settings, And although it seems to slightly improve the performance of the 5600X over high settings, you actually get much worse 0.1% laws and stutters, so the game will actually feel a lot worse at this setting. Not that you actually need to go down to this setting with any of these systems realistically though. Now we're going to have a quick look at 1080p, and this is the same thing. You're getting them terrible 0.1% laws, and I wasn't even able to lock 60 with the 5600X here, whereas it was easy work for the X3D. So in this one, both CPUs are pretty easily able to lock 60, so if that's all you're aiming for, either will do really. There is some good benefits to the smoothness of gameplay with the 5800X 3D though, and at certain settings you'll be able to get that lock 60 with a bit better image quality. And if you are someone playing at 1080p or for some reason 1440p medium settings, you won't suffer the same stutters that you do with the 5600X. Anyway, now we're moving on to Resident Evil 4, and this is the start of my run here from when I jumped down here. I have a little run around, throw some grenades, whatever. Really intensive on the CPU here, with all the AI running around, and the Chainsaw Man makes it even worse. It's also really annoying to benchmark, but I really like to get it within this area because it's full of combat, intense, and obviously that's when you want to know that your frame rates are going to be good. You'll notice at 1440p I only use one FSR setting, and that's because it's just so CPU limited at that point that you don't gain anything from going down other than worse image quality. So we're going to start off at 4K, and this is the max preset, and as you can see here both CPUs are easily able to lock 60, but there's barely anything gained from adding FSR for the 5600X, whereas the X3D does get a pretty good boost with FSR, allowing it to lock 90 with FSR quality and even higher with performance. Not that I'd actually use performance because it looks terrible in this game. Even the gains at FSR quality with the X3D are pretty massive though. Now we go down to the prioritised graphics preset, and we're pretty much within margin of error without FSR, but once again with the X3D destroys the 5600X. With quality mode enabled, it was 16% better in the averages, 32% better in the 1% lows, and 19% better in the minimums, and it really does feel smooth this game with the X3D system. Moving down to 1440p max preset now, and looking at the minimums here, I probably wouldn't use FSR for either CPU. So without, we still see the X3D is destroying the 5600X at these settings, been 33% better in the averages, 54% smoother in the 1% lows, and the minimums were 38% higher. And we're able to get a lock 90 or even 100 here, whereas the 5600X struggles, but it's fine for 60. So moving down to the prioritised graphics settings, which turns ray tracing off, giving both CPUs a break. Although once again FSR is pretty useless here. We're getting some great frame rates with both CPUs, but the 5800X 3D was able to lock 120 here and had 40% better averages, 26% smoother 1% lows, and 36% higher minimums. So now we're going to take a quick look at 1080p. And we see with the 5600X we're limited in the same FPS ranges as we were with 1440p and 4K. And it's not too far different with the 5800X 3D either. We can almost lock that 144Hz there, but not quite. How much the 1080p data really matters? Questionable. Anyway, as you can see, both CPUs are able to offer some really great frame rates in this one, but there is some pretty great gains to smoothness with the 5800X 3D, and if you're looking for a lock 90 with ray tracing enabled or 120 without, you're going to at least need this CPU or one of a similar performance. But if you're someone who's just happy with 60 FPS with ray tracing enabled or 90 without, the 5600X should definitely be enough for you in this game. So now we have Call of Duty Modern Warfare 2. And for this I use the benchmark, so I haven't bothered including the run because it's just the benchmark. So we'll just have a bit of gameplay in the background and get straight into the numbers. Starting out with 4K, unsurprisingly the 5600X is actually coming out on top in quite a lot of metrics at these settings, even in the 1% lows. I also found this when I tested the 4080, so I guess I'm lying, it wasn't a surprise. But either way, they're probably within margin of errors. 8% in the averages at best isn't massive. So now we're going to go down to the balanced, basic and minimum settings. And once again, at balanced and basic, the 5600X is consistently winning. Never manages to beat the X3D by 10%, but it is still the best CPU there. But when going down to the ridiculous frame rates of minimum settings, you're actually starting to become CPU limited now. And the X3D comes back being 44% better in the averages, 36% smoother in the 1% lows, and 41% higher in the minimums. Now we have 1440p Ultra, and with no upscaling, the CPUs are neck and neck. But when adding FSR quality, the 5600X hits a wall, unlike the 5800X 3D, which keeps getting better even with FSR balanced, allowing it to beat the 5600X by 30% in the averages, 22% in the 1% lows, and 27% in the minimums. Both are still capable of great frame rates though. At balanced basic and minimum, the 5600X scales a little bit better now, but still takes a good beast in from the 5800X 3D. Due to being much more CPU limited at this resolution, even at balanced settings, the X3D is 24% faster on average, 22% better in the 1% lows, and has 23% better minimums, and it only extends its lead going down in settings. Now we have 1080p, and I thought I'd include a few more settings here with it being a multiplayer game, but I didn't want to add too much FSR to make it too blurry. Some pretty massive frame rates with both at any setting here. But if you're trying to reduce your input latency as much as possible, the 5800X 3D does still offer a nice boost to the frame rates, being up to 41% faster in the averages with DLSS quality enabled FSR. I decided to skip minimum settings here as it's just ridiculously blurry, so I went with balance with FSR quality and basic settings. And as you can see, the 5600X basically gains nothing from turning down the settings, even from the ultra settings. There is a slight boost for the X3D, but for me it's nothing that's realistically worth it for the degradation of image quality when trying to pick off targets at a long distance. So in this one, if you want to play at 4K with all the graphics maxed out, you'll actually find the 5600X is slightly better than the 5800X 3D. Actually, at anything other than the minimum settings at 4K, it's still the better CPU. But if you're playing at 1440p or 1080p, the 5800X 3D might be worth it for you if you are someone who can really feel the differences between these really high frame rates and you're looking for the lowest input lag you can get, well, on AM4 anyway. Or you have a 240Hz monitor and you want to max it out. But if you're someone with a 120Hz monitor or 165 or anything in between and you just want to max them out and keep the graphics settings pretty high so you get a nice visual experience as well, then either CPU is fine. So now we have Warzone, and I don't have my run, but if you want to see it, it's in all of my other Warzone CPU comparison videos, but it's in this building anyway. And the reason I picked this building is it seems to be really harsh on your CPU. So you might look at my frame rates and think they're really low, I get this or whatever, and so do I, but obviously in this building it's rough. So outside I might get 30 more FPS or whatever, but I just try to pick the most CPU limited area that I could think of. And I don't know what it is about this building, but this is it. You also might find that in a different area you might get more of a boost from turning down the settings or doing FSR, as you're not quite as CPU limited in them areas. But being so harsh on your CPU, I thought this was a good place to try and compare the CPUs, and it's also kind of sheltered and out of the way, so I don't have to die 5 million times, only about 80. Anyway, going to 4K ultra settings now, and as you can see the 5600X doesn't gain anything from going down in settings really. It actually ended up slightly worse. Although the 5800X 3D does gain some alright gains in the minimums and 1% lows, allowing it to smash the 5600X by 47% in the averages, 37% in the 1% lows, and 44% in the minimums at best. Now we have balanced basic and minimum settings, and pretty much it's exactly the same. Slightly better averages for the 5800X 3D than it had at the ultra settings with FSR, but mostly everywhere else were within margin of error. And the 5800X 3D was able to beat the 5600X by 43% in the averages, 37% in the 1% lows, and 41% in the minimums. At 1440p Ultra, we see very similar numbers as we did at 4K, as the CPUs are just completely the limiting factor here, which allows the 5800X 3D system to beat the 5600X system by 42% in the averages, 29% in the 1% lows, and 44% in the minimums at best. Well, best for the X3D anyway. Going down to balanced, basic and medium settings, at least in the particular area I tested, I'd say there's not really any point turning down the settings. You are getting a couple of frames here and there with both CPUs, but for the trade-off you're getting invisibility, or the lack of visibility that is, it's not really worth it. And once again, between the CPUs we're pretty much exactly the same as we were ultra settings. So now we're going to go down to 1080p, and if you do have a higher resolution monitor, it really isn't worth turning down to 1080p here, as you're not gaining anything. Both CPUs are offering very similar frame rates as they were at 4K and 1440p, with the X3D beating the lower end CPU by 44% in the averages, 32% in the 1% lows, and 39% in the minimums, with no FSR enabled. Now we turn down to the balance preset and the basic preset, and we do gain a few extra frames with both CPUs here, but like I said earlier, for the trade-off in lack of visibility at these low resolutions, the extra couple of FPS definitely aren't going to improve your game. And once again, on average, we're about 40% better with the X3D. Like I said in the intro of this game though, the area I chose is really CPU limited, and going through the numbers here, I'm not really sure it was the best idea to choose that area, as you might have seen the performance scale a little better going down in settings if I'd picked somewhere that was just a little bit less CPU limited, or maybe ran between two areas with different levels of CPU demand. I do think this is the best way to compare the actual CPUs, but that might have given you a better overall idea of what performance you'd get when not completely clamped by your CPU performance. But looking at the two CPUs in this kind of worst case scenario, the 5800 X3D performs just over 40% better than the averages and minimums, and its percentile lows are smoother by just over 30%, so there's some pretty big gains there. And it allows you to lock 120 FPS or even 144 FPS even in these situations with much smoother gameplay, while the 5600X is only able to lock around 100 FPS, but the game's still more than playable at this frame rate in my opinion. But it's obviously much more preferable to watch yourself die at 140 FPS than it is at 100. Anyway, on to Star Wars, and this is my little run on the screen here. It is a pretty long one, and it's quite CPU limited, especially with ray tracing enabled. There's a bit of everything really, a bit of climbing, a bit of fighting, and there's this fluorescent light right near the end of my run, which you'll see, and that tanks your frame rate, so you might see my minimums being quite low compared to my averages, but I chose that area because obviously if there's an area what can tank your frame rate that much, then there's probably going to be other areas in the game that do tank your frame rate that much, and possibly for a longer period of time. If you don't know what tanked means, I mean dropped my frame rate. Anyway, going into 4K now, we have epic settings with RT enabled. And as you can see, there's not a massive difference to the CPUs at this setting, but I was able to lock 60 with one less level of FSR there with the 5800 X3D, so you're able to lock 60 with better image quality, and I'm not a big fan of FSR in this particular game, so the less you can get away with using, the better. Turning RT off now, but staying with the epic settings, you'll see we're a lot less CPU limited now, allowing both CPUs to scale a little bit better. But the 5600X does hit a wall immediately of FSR quality there, allowing the 5800 X3D some pretty big gains with up to 34% in the averages, 33% better 1% lows, and 19% better minimums. Neither was able to lock 90 though. Now we turn down to high settings with RT enabled, and due to the ridiculous CPU limitation with RT on in this game, the numbers are pretty similar to the were at Epic with RT, and actually with the 5600X I actually dropped below 60 even with FSR balanced here, so it's probably a little bit better on Epic, but obviously minimums are up and down, so realistically it's within margin of error. The X3D does make its lock 60 a little bit more comfortable though. Turning off RT now, the 5600X is hitting the same wall it was at Epic with RT off, and the X3D isn't doing much better, but with FSR balanced I was able to lock 90 FPS here, but only just, and it increases its lead a tiny bit over the 5600X. So now we're going down to 1440p Epic with RT, and here you'll see I haven't included any FSR because it doesn't actually improve your performance at all, at least not in the area I tested anyway. Here the 5800 X3D slightly beats the 5600X in the averages and minimums, and gets a lead of 11% in the 1% lows. Now we turn off RT and we hit the same wall that we did at 4K with the 5600X. Whereas the 5800X 3D was allowed to squeeze out just a little bit more performance, getting a nice comfortable lock 90 now, pretty much destroying the 5600X by 45% in the averages, 43% in the 1% lows, and 49% in the minimums. So now we turn down to high settings with RT enabled, and we see a similar thing than we did at 4K at the same setting, where the 5600X is no longer able to lock 60. I don't know if this is because it's too CPU limited, or just bad luck really, I'm not sure. The 5800X 3D on the other hand has a nice comfortable lock 60, which I'd be pretty confident it won't drop below. Turning RT off at the same settings. And as no surprise to anyone, we're pretty much getting the exact same frame rates here, especially with the 5600X. So you might as well just stay epic with either CPU. So we're going to have a quick look at 1080p now, and no surprises, we've seen these numbers before. This is where both CPUs are limited, so you're pretty much stuck here really. Probably just refer to 1440p if you want to know what the other settings are going to look like. Anyway, as you can see in this game, it is very CPU heavy. If you are happy with a lock 60 and you don't really care about the ray tracing, then you'll be sound with the 5600X. But if you're hoping for higher frame rates, or you want to get that guaranteed lock 60 with ray tracing enabled, you probably do need the 5800X 3D or a CPU of similar performance. Although turning down to medium settings can give you a few extra FPS, but I just feel like with the graphics card this powerful, you shouldn't really need to turn down to medium settings, as it is the CPU's fault, but that's up to you. Now we have Valorant, and I use the team deathmatch on this. I don't really know much about the game, so I'm not really sure if that was a good idea or a bad idea, to be honest. But they both contain the same amount of team members, and in this one they're all always constantly on the map pretty much because the instant spawn, so if anything I'd say this is a little bit heavier on the CPU, but I'm not sure, please correct me if I'm wrong. As you don't get to select what level you're going on, I've ended up with different levels for different resolutions, but I'll explain what level I was on when I get to that section. But I did make sure to use the same levels for the same resolution when I was testing the next CPU. Anyway, hopefully I've explained myself out of any death threats from Valorant players, so let's get into it. So we're going to start out with 4K resolution. I don't imagine many people actually play the game at, but as you can see, both CPUs get great frame rates in this game. And for some reason with the 5800X 3D, the best frame rates I got were at the highest settings. But then again, at frame rates this high, 20 FPS is probably within margin of error to be realistic. At the high settings, the X3D was able to beat the 5600X by 42% in the averages, 60% in the 1% lows and 40% in the minimums. Just before I forget, I was on the Casbah map for 4K and the District one for 1440p. 1440p, I'd say the numbers are pretty much within margin of error again, so there's not going to be any realistic benefit from turning down the settings. So at high settings, the 5800X 3D was able to beat the 5600X by 45% in the averages, 33% in the 1% lows and 49% in the minimums, providing a much smoother experience. Well, if you're someone with ninja-like reflexes who can actually feel the differences in latency there anyway. Now we have 1080p, and I use the Casbah map again here, and realistically there's only a tiny little boost going from 4K to 1080p here. At high settings I was able to get 46% better averages, 39% better 1% lows and 52% better minimums with the X3D here. But both CPUs were pumping out some really high frame rates, so there's only going to be certain people that are going to be able to tell the difference. And looking at the different settings, I'd say you might as well just stick with high, because you're basically within margin of error at these high frame rates. So yeah, in this game both CPUs are knocking out some really high frame rates, and I'd say for the average person either would be fine, but if you do have elite level reflexes or just someone who can actually tell the difference between them frame rates, there is some massive gains with the 5800X 3D, so it could be worth it for you if you are that person, or just someone who owns a 240Hz monitor, you can get that easily locked there. Yeah, so as you can see, there's quite a lot to be gained by going with a higher end CPU here. And the 5600X is holding the 7900 XTX back quite a lot, and you're leaving quite a lot of performance on the table in some games. And the 5800X3D is a much better match for the 7900 XTX, and can provide you with a much smoother experience. But like I said earlier in the video, it isn't a necessity, but it is a very nice to have. It's nice to know you're not holding your GPU back a lot, because it does seem like a little bit of a waste to have it run at 70% or whatever because your CPU is not strong enough. But on the other hand, if you are someone that is happy with 60 FPS in the single player titles, you don't mind using a little bit more FSR to get you at a similar frame rate as you would with a higher end CPU, and you don't really see the benefits to getting these already massive multiplayer frame rates even higher, then the 5600X could be enough for you. And for anyone who cares, would I buy the CPU with this graphics card? Yes, but should you? Well, that's up to you. I'm sorry my conclusion is very inconclusive, but it really does depend what games you play and how much value you hold in getting these particular things out of those games, whether it be the slightly better image quality or the super high frame rate or maxing out your 240Hz monitor, or getting 120 FPS over 90. It's just how much value you hold in it. My thoughts realistically don't matter. I'm just here to provide the numbers. So have a look through the numbers and obviously other videos that aren't by me, and hopefully it'll help you decide whether the value is there for you. I also want to mention the fact that these areas in the games, well, most of them anyway, have been chosen to punish the CPU, so there's probably areas within them games, well there definitely will be in some, where the CPUs are a lot closer together as you're not as CPU limited in that area. And also the fact that the games themselves have been chosen because they're mainly pretty rough on the CPU, or the CPU is very important to give high frame rates. So in the majority of games, most of which won't be as demanding as these, you might find that the CPUs are a lot less important, as it really is a small minority of games that cause such problems for the CPU. But looking at all the newest releases, even games that weren't out when I first started this video, like Starfield, etc., it does seem we are going in a direction. I mean, I could be wrong here, it's not guaranteed, but it just seems this way anyway, where the new games coming out seem to be pretty rough on your CPU. Hopefully they'll be able to sort that out in the future, but, well, the way it's looking, it's not looking great. Not for AAA anyway. Also, while I've hopefully still got your attention, I'd just like to ask you a question, if you don't mind commenting in the comments with the answer. With these high-end systems like the 4080 one and the 7900 XTX one, in these CPU comparisons or GPU ones, in single-player titles, are you really bothered about the 1080p data? Are people interested in that, or am I just putting it in just for the sake of it really? Your thoughts on that would be really appreciated. I also just want to apologise to the people expecting the 6800 XT or 6950 XT. I managed to borrow this card, which was an opportunity I wasn't expecting, so I took it while I could, but I will get round to it as soon as I can. And thanks again Mark for borrowing me the card. Cheers mate. Anyway, after all that rambling, I'd just like to say thanks a lot for watching my video. If you liked the video, please give it a like and subscribe for more. Thanks, bye.